Hello everyone, this is Chromý and together we will continue the course Interdisciplinary Approaches to Language and its Use. This will be the last presentation in the series on language acquisition. We will focus on the acquisition of grammar again. We already discussed the process of grammatical development, and we found that during the third year of life, children typically acquire their native language grammar. In this presentation, we will briefly mention some typical phenomena which emerge during the process. First, let's have a look at a schema from a classic book by Roger Brown. We see the results of three longitudinally recorded children, Adam, Eve, and Sarah. The Roman numerals refer to a specific developmental stage based on the mean length of utterance. The numbers in round brackets describe the age of the child. The number before the semicolon refers to years, and the number after the semicolon to months. But what is crucial here is the order of produced grammatical functions. The first column describes this order for the first child. We can see that at the age of 2 years and 6 months, the child started to use the present progressive, and shortly afterwards also the prepositions in and on, and the plural suffix s. Only when the child was 3 years and 6 months, it started to use the third person singular s, and also other grammatical functions such as past regular ed, and so on. You can see that the third child reported here is the fastest one, and for example it started to use the present progressive already at around 1 year and 10 months, and past regular at 2 years and 2 months. But the most important thing probably is that the order of acquisition is highly similar in all three children. For example, the present progressive and the prepositions in and on are always somewhere on the top. Third person regular somewhere in the middle, and always at the bottom is the contractible auxiliary, such as is in the sentence Mom is eating a cake. This shows that some grammatical features are easier to acquire for the child than others. Crucially, the data we presented here and in the previous presentation were based on English, which is a highly isolating language. This means that the grammatical functions are typically expressed by independently standing grammatical words and only to a very limited extent by the use of grammatical suffixes. On the other hand, in the highly inflectional languages, such as in various Slavic languages, many findings would be somehow different. For example, in Czech, infants do not omit bound grammatical morphemes such as endings. The word kráva, a cow, is not reduced to the stem as kráv. However, this does not mean that the children do not struggle with the grammatical system too. Typically, children at first use only one form for the whole paradigm, such as svítí, which means it shines, and only later they start to acquire other forms. There are many interesting features which would deserve to be analyzed. If you are a speaker of a language which is less researched from this perspective, such as Czech, it may be a promising topic to focus on. Another issue in the acquisition of grammar is productivity. A classic study we should mention is a paper by Jean Berko-Gleason, The Child's Learning of English Morphology. Berko came up with the so-called VAC test, which examines the children's knowledge of the abstract grammatical rules of a language. At first, children saw a picture of a bird-like creature and they were told, "This is a VAC." Then they saw two of these creatures and were told, "Now there is another one. There are two of them. There are two," and the child had to respond. Importantly, this test examined whether the children were able to create the grammatically correct form from the word they never heard before. In this study, Berko found that children between 4 and 7 years old were able to pass this test well. This is not surprising that much, but the very invention of the VAC test influenced the later psycholinguistics heavily. One interesting issue in the grammatical development are the so-called over-regularizations. What we know is that at some point children often start to over-regularize grammatical rules, which means that they start to produce grammatically regular but incorrect forms such as goat instead of went, tooth instead of teeth. Importantly, the development is not linear. Children first produce correct forms, later they start to over-regularize, and in the end they return to the correct forms. One possible explanation of this process was proposed by Gary Marcus and his colleagues in the early 1990s. They claimed that children need to learn two things: the irregular forms, which are stored in the declarative memory, and the rules for forming the regular forms, which are stored in the procedural memory. At first, children learn the irregular forms, but they are later overlaid by the rules for forming the regular forms. At last, children uncover that there are certain words which are exceptions from the rules and start to use them correctly. However, a more credible interpretation comes from a study by Robert Marsland, Anna Theakston, Elena Levin, and Michael Tomasello. Based on dense corpus data, the authors argue that the tendency to over-regularize is a result of the frequency distribution of regular and irregular words. More precisely, they claim that the higher the type frequency of regular words in the input, the higher tendency to over-regularize. And on the other hand, the higher the number of token frequency of irregular words, the higher tendency to the correct use of the irregular words. You may ask, what is type and token frequency? In this case, the type frequency is the number of distinct regular words. It does not matter how many times one hears each of them. Each distinct word is counted only once. Token frequency, on the other hand, is the number of occurrences of irregular words. This means that the more times each of the irregular words is used, the higher is the token frequency. We will end this presentation with a few slides on one important method in the early acquisition of grammar research. When we discussed word learning, we saw that the productive and receptive vocabulary differs largely, especially during the early phases. In other words, children start to understand words earlier than they start to produce them. The same goes for grammar. For example, we know from the research by Roberta Golinkoff and her colleagues that 16 to 19-month-olds can already differentiate English transitive sentences such as Big Bird is tickling Cookie Monster and Cookie Monster is tickling Big Bird. Big Bird and Cookie Monster are characters from a famous TV show Sesame Street, which is especially popular in the English-speaking world. In other words, the children know them. But the question is, how do the authors know that children are able to understand these sentences? The method which was used in this paper was the preferential looking task. Nowadays, it is one of the basic methods which are easy to use in early language acquisition. This is a schema of the setting. The child sits on the caregiver's lap, and in front of them there is a light and an amplifier. There are also two monitors, one on the left and the other one on the right. The child receives instructions from the amplifier, for example, where's the boat? Find the boat. Importantly, the boat in this case is only on one of the monitors. In case the child knows the word boat, it should look to the monitor on the right. What is measured is the gaze direction of the child. On this schema, the method is applied for word knowledge, but it can be of course applied to the grammatical knowledge too. For example, if we would want to test the sentence Big Bird is tickling Cookie Monster and Cookie Monster is tickling Big Bird, we could use pictures such as these. Before we will conclude this presentation, I have one reading tip for you. We have briefly mentioned that there are asymmetries in language comprehension and production in infants. If you are interested in these issues, you may want to read the paper by Petra Hendricks and Charlotte Costa, Production Comprehension Asymmetries in Language Acquisition. This was the last video on language acquisition, but we will stick to psycholinguistics even in the future sessions. If you enjoyed the videos, we would be glad if you would like them on YouTube. That is all from me now. See you next time.